For several episodes on the BAJ podcast, I have been speaking to practitioners and other professionals who are considering alternative ways of sourcing and using materials, or investigate the consideration of materials from alternative perspectives. When considering these alternative approaches to materials and making, you may come across biodesign, which can be understood as a means to incorporate the inherent life-conducive principles of biological living systems into design and making process. And this really in order to move towards a more sustainable and caring future. If we want to become more empathic towards our environment, so we can co-create, collaborate with non-humans, whilst constructing and most importantly, improving our context, wouldn't it be important we gain an understanding of these living systems first? A creative exercise I often invite students to undertake is to imagine what it would be like to look at the world through the perspective of someone or something else. I myself have wondered what the world would feel like to the beautiful tree I regularly pass by. Someone who has asked themselves this very question and many more questions in relation to the topic of biodesign is a researcher, designer, and artist, Yuning Chen. To tell us more about their career, practice, and the materials she's been investigating as part of her projects, I'm really excited to welcome Yuning.
Hi, Sophie. Thank you for having me.
So to start, Yuning, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
Okay, so I'm Yuning Chen, a Chinese-born artist, currently doing my second year PhD at University of Edinburgh. So I'm based in design informatics, and my research primarily looks at the ethics of working with modern human in fields of biodesign and also other design fields that intersect with biotechnology, such as synthetic biology or plant biology, etc.
You studied industrial design, environmental science, and you then achieved an MA from the RCA in innovation design before then going on to this PhD at the University of Edinburgh. What drew you to this career trajectory, these subjects?
So I actually started with environmental science, thinking that I'm going to save the world, especially after all of this crisis happening. Although I had major existential crisis when I'm doing my undergrad in environmental science, when I noticed that a lot of the techniques that we are learning about solving environmental issues, for example, like soil pollution and etc., or solid waste management, are usually resulting from like very tiny user behaviors that is very hard to kind of change. And then I often ask my professor, like, why are we solving these problems at the downstream instead of like telling people not to do this or just try to sort their trash, like such an easy goal. And then they often tell you that social changes is way harder than technological change. That's why it's very easy for people to veer into the realm of technocentrism and seeking all the solutions there. And then I came across this notion of sustainable design where designers are thinking about how they could use product from the upstream to interface with the users so that they could already change their behavior and or just make it easier for people to choose a more sustainable products or materials in the first place. So I kind of developed a design portfolio to change my course from like working on, on the downstream where I considered often solving the result which already happened of some undesirable behaviors to maybe I think consider the root of the question or the upstream, which is to interface human behavior and how I can use design as a tool to achieve that. But then when I'm actually in the design field back in the RCA and also Imperial College, I realized that there's also many limitations in design as a discipline that is bound by the goal of production and creating products and being subsumed by consumerism. And coming from the field of environmental science, I'm quite naturally drawn to working with living organisms. And also the agency, the special kind of changefulness of living organisms inevitably change the kind of creative dynamics in design. Like, so even the little interaction between a designer and, say, a plant or some bacteria, you realize you're not always in control, and you need to kind of give them space to manifest their properties or their needs, their voice, and let them to lead your design agenda, for example. So I got very inspired through this process of learning with modern human organisms and started to think about if they could already challenge the kind of authority of a designer in the design process. How could they also challenge, the wider power dynamics between human and nature? So that's what I kind of started into my PhD research, which really looks into how incorporating modern human organisms in design as a way of social engagement or political engagement from the part of the modern human organisms, less about how to use them to create novel materials or products, but more about how design could be used as a tool for them to voice their needs.
As a researcher, you indicate you work at the intersection of multi-species ethics and biotechnology, and your research has been focusing, and this word I really like a lot, on carefulness in these contexts. Could you tell us a little bit more about this as part of your research and your approach through a lens of multi-species epistemology, ethics, and sociality?
So thinking about care ethics is really an effort that tries to transcend speciesism, because when we talk about morality or ethics in design or in biodesign, people often think about the ethics of the designer and the user, or how do we ethically interface user or ethical sourcing products. Like, there is a range of ethical relevance centering human and then the organisms that are more close to humans, in close proximity, such as pets, and then the wider range and further into the organisms that are less relevant to humans, for example, like microbes or fungi. Thinking about the ethics of working with fungi, maybe one might find it very abstract to think about. And care ethics doesn't care about whether you are talking about a cat or a dog or like a tree or a microbe or a human, because it's about relations. So when you relate to your water bottle, for example, or you relate to a tree near your house, you are caring about them through this relationship. Doesn't really matter what it was and what species they're in. And talking about epistemology, modern human epistemology, ethics, and sociality, more specifically at an epistemic level, it's about how humans could think about the limitations bound by their own perception and the creative agency of the modern human, of the yeast, for example, of the living organisms that they work with. And one of my supervisors had worked on a very inspiring project where they see how genetic editing with yeast could leave more creative agency to the yeast, which leave the yeast to come up with more evolution strategy instead of directly editing the yeast genome to let them to perform whatever they want them to perform, to produce like valuable compounds, for example. So even in different ways of hardcore biotechnological research, there is still space to negotiate creative agency between humans and modern humans. And going back to the ethics level, what I'm interested in is more about like the concept of revolt and non-participation, and also embedded forms of coercion in the tools and the environment we use to interact with living organisms. So first is about like talking about non-participation. There's a growing trend in biodesign that talks about like working with living organisms or collaborating with living organisms, whereas not enough attention in thinking about the rhetoric of what does it mean to engage with modern human or collaborate in comparison to coercion. Just because we put them in a context of design doesn't necessarily mean that we're not necessarily exploiting them. So if we don't craft a space for non-participation or for revolt, then it's very hard to safeguard modern human participatory design from coercion. And to the sociality level is to really think about civic engagement from the perspective of the modern human, where their contribution to our work, creative work or scientific research, are usually routinely backgrounded. When they make things work, it's mostly taken for granted. But when they revolt, it's usually considered as a nuisance to be tackled. So how can their labor be seen and be recognized, and how they could have political relevance and to voice their needs, I think would be a very important theme that I'm researching on, like how modern human perspectives can really extend political significance to the modern human realm.
When you talk about the ethics and sort of enabling or allowing for revolt, there is a need for translation, I guess, or an interpretation of signals. So I want to ask, like, how does one go about this translation, this interpretation? Are there some key tools, or is this very much in development still today?
I think this is a really good question. So people have been approaching this from different perspectives, and I think the overarching premises is that the important thing of trying to understand the modern human perspective is not necessarily about whether we 100% correctly represent it or understand it, what they're trying to do, but it's more about the importance it lies in the displacement from the anthropocentric perspective. So the only thing we can do is to constantly initiate such displacement, whether from our language or from our perception or from our modes of understanding things, which epistemology. So more practically, after this premise, what people have been doing is that there are more kind of scientific approach and more kind of intuitive and artistic creative approach. From the more kind of scientific ways, there are people that are very attentive to the organisms they work with. There's a very good reference from the book Feeling for the Organism by Voss Keller, who writes this book about the very famous biologist McIntosh back in the days. She's very famous because of her overly attentiveness to the organisms she worked with, which are maize, a plant, and then she understands it so attentively, she could notice very, very minor changes, and she really built in-depth relations with it. She kind of interprets the different metabolic signals of the plant so as also to respond to their changes. And her attentiveness and close relationship with the plants has been criticized by many other scientists. It was seen as highly unscientific and unprofessional. But later on, her very detailed understanding of the plant actually leads to a very important scientific discovery in a transposon gene, which is jumping gene from different organisms. I'm not entirely sure how it works, but there are like more kind of objective attentiveness and maybe more descriptive attentiveness to the organisms in the scientific communities. And there are all like from the more creative side, people have been developing different kind of interface that either translate the perceptual reality of different organisms into human perceivable spectrums. And there are also people that tries to develop direct interaction tools, for example, like interfacing with microbes and games with microbes that you could really attune your temporality, your rhythm of time to the rhythm of time of the other organisms. So understanding another organism comes with many different forms. It doesn't necessarily restrict it into a linguistic format. It has many different dimensions, such as somatic, like bodily perception, because different organisms live in different spectrum of perception. There's also like temporality, where different organisms develop and perceive time differently, and scale, where obviously we have different size, and that has a very big implications in the way we interact with our living environment. Yeah, so I think all of these are very interesting space that one can make displacement to.
One very interesting project you completed prior to starting your research is Habitat. Could you tell us a little bit more about this specific project?
So it started with the concept of ecological service. Oh, so I'm very familiar with this concept back in the days when I'm in environmental science, where we kind of evaluate the function of different organisms with respect to the maintaining of their own ecosystem. And there is also a more kind of anthropocentric perspective on how the organisms is quite, from a utility perspective, useful to the environment. But there's never a definition or a metrics for ecological services provided by humans, because I guess we perceive ourselves as the owner and manager of the ecosystem, and that is our function, maybe. And we came across this quite dystopic event, which is ash dieback, where ash trees are approaching extinction in a rapid pace around temporal climate. And at that time, I was thinking, what if we could make humans to perform some sort of ecological services, and really trying to kind of also decenter the human from the perspective of ecological services. And we also realized that it's not just that ash tree is dying off, but over thousands of organisms that are dependent on ash trees are also facing secondary extinction, because they are the ash tree that they're relying on are like basically vanishing, whereas it's very slow for the other disciplines to follow up with the speed of ash tree dieback. And one particular field of kind of species are the microbes and fungi, which in this case, what we're focusing on is lichen. And lichen is a very interesting symbiotic organisms between fungi and algae cells. And in our research, we realized that the conservation efforts for fungi research or other continent species are almost 30 years behind all the animal research, according to an interview from a Kew Garden expert. And then we decided to center them as our kind of protagonists in this project, because there are more than 900 kinds of species of lichen actually dependent on the ash tree. So after talking to many different conservationists and ecologists and ash tree experts, we realized that what makes ash tree so special for its hospitality for different species is actually its special tree morphology in its bark and its canopy. So we designed this wearables that kind of resemble or mimic the properties of the bark, and thinking about its light intensity in position with the human body. So there's a bit of jump here. The connection was we're thinking about how human could perform an ecosystem services. And then at the same time, we're learning what makes ash tree special. So the connection here is that we need a lot of ash trees to really replicate this niche for lichens. But we couldn't, if we are just replicating artificial ash trees in the city, it would need a lot of ash trees to actually accommodate. So we were thinking about, here is the aha moment where we think about the movement of human as a hiring rate for the air to support the airborne dissemination of the lichen, so that we could reduce the need to replicate all of the ash tree density by using human as a mobile host for the lichen. Because what really lichen needs is not necessarily a density of space, like areas to grow on, but a density between proximity of different lichen communities. So they need to communicate or interact with different lichens on their habitat. So this is a very good connection that we draw. So we created this wearable jewelries that resemble ash tree properties and use human as kind of alternative surrogate hosts to provide for the lichen in a period where Astri is disappearing. If that makes sense.
It's a really fascinating project, I have to say. I want to ask you one thing as well. You often say wearables. You did mention jewelry. Where do you make the distinction between what is a wearable and what is jewelry?
Okay, I think I'm just very conscious about this, especially when we're doing the project. Personally, I think jewelry has a higher aesthetic function, although it could bear a lot of different functionality or interact with the body in many different ways. But what the major dominant kind of pulse behind it is more about how wearing certain jewelries bear meanings and culture and identity to the person. Whereas wearable, they don't necessarily have a very heavy kind of cultural weight behind it. It can be way more simple in terms of just recording a person's heart rate or a sports wearable or yeah. So it's more driven by utility per se, which give them different opportunities and space to work with. And at the beginning, I think we are more thinking about wearable from a functional perspective. And we were faced with lots of tension or criticism in terms of how this actually work. Why would people want to wear it? Like a lot of criticism from the utility perspective. Then we kind of veered into a more jewelry-oriented strategy, whereas we try to come up with an aesthetic that could justify people's intention to wear it. So I think it's quite interesting where you are approaching yourself or trying to position yourself in the different definitions to make a niche for your concept.
So in theory, you were designing a system, a function, a process, a material, and it was to be worn. But then for it to be a reason to be worn, you needed to venture into what you think is jewelry so that it could. So that's very interesting, actually. Lots of food for thought there. Talking about, translating signals, you've worked on another project, which I think, again, from a jewelry perspective, is very interesting, called Plant Reality Set. So a set of wearables that take you to the world of a rooted organism. And when wearing it, you can attend to and harmonize with the flow of nature like a plant. Could you tell us a little bit more about that project and how it relates to the previous one?
So really, after working so much with trees and lichens, I got really fascinated by plants because I didn't know like all the plants in your day-to-day reality are such complex beings. And then I read so much about plants' perceptions and adaptability, and I realized there is actually a group of scientists that think that plants are conscious and they are intelligent and complex beings. So I really wondered how walking into the reality of a plant could help us learn a little bit about how a plant would perceive the world and respond to the world. And yeah, I think there are many ways that one can approach this project, right? They could just grab some signals from a plant and translate it into something else, or they could draw a plant, they could, I don't know, make sculptures, but at that time, I was really fascinated by the plant perceptions, which is their exceptional wide spectrum, for example, of light, and then their sensibility of the soil moisture. And I saw experiments where people are interacting with plant roots, where they put water sound at different directions, and then the plant root can grow into it. And then as if they know, like where the water is. And then they also learned that like how does plant know where is upwards? Because they always grow upward or towards the light. So there are just so many sensations that plants harness, rely on to adapt to the space that they are grown in because they have no way of actually moving like us to avoid harm and risk. So there are like I choose a few senses to translate into our own spectrum, for example, like light and soil moisture is really based on what I've read. But it was a really hard decision to make to like, what should I translate? There are so many of them, and none of the choice would justify itself as being fully representative. But among those, I want to like just give it a sense of the one of the piece from the plant reality set that I really like. It's the light sensor, where the participant or the wearer could have light sensors on their fingers and then have a mouth taste stimulator in their tongue. And then you could explore the spectrum of light with your fingers in the air. And then it would translate into different taste. When the spectrums are good for the plant growth and photosynthesis, it will be reflected on the taste as sweet. And when the spectrum is slightly harming the plant chloroplasts, which potentially it's higher spectrum of LV light, UV light, it would hurt the plant and it would translate to the taste like more spicy. So I let the wearer to kind of really explore in the space of what their taste is like, what their favorite taste is like. And this reflects on, will be correspond to one of their kind of position in the air. And that is analogous to plant growing in the space and trying to really define their own body shape based on the light distribution around them. And I think through that act, you don't necessarily understand the plant more or from a linguistic perspective or biology perspective. But what I really like about it is the behavioral mapping between human and plant, because obviously you can't really make a human into a plant. But I like to think about in the different translations, how do you really capture the spirit of the species and then trying to represent that to a human experience? It's like in translation between different language, you could do like a phonetic translation, or you could do like a meaning-based translation, which doesn't necessarily resemble the pronunciation of the other language, but it kind of brings the meaning across to another language. So there's a lot of design decision made in the design of plant reality set where I'm thinking, am I doing a literal translation or am I more doing a behavioral or a perceptual translation?
Must have been quite hard to make those kinds of decisions, I'm sure. Just to go back to sort of, you call that a wearable, but do you think there is a sort of jewelry approach there, or is that for you not quite the project?
I think definitely, yeah. If one wants to really attune to the plant, they actually need to be in their kind of perceptual spectrum for a long time. Attunement is not like a one-time, one-off experience. It takes time to really adjust. It's like time difference. When you have jet lag, you need a long time to recover. So I think there are definitely opportunities to think about more jewelry format where the plant reality set become a long-term companion on human body, and it provides another perceptual modality to them.
Technology is a brilliant vehicle for some of these applications, but it has its own challenges in terms of how we are able to work with technology, the materials it takes to create technological instruments. How do you live with that duality when you're talking about production as well? Like you're on that verge of design being expected to produce. And I think that's true for jewelry slightly as well, where there is sometimes an expectation for the multiplication. And I could quite easily see the plant reality set translated into a piece of jewelry and being produced. But then we are also talking about creating another object on the planet using technological materials. What's your thoughts on this?
I think my main limitation here is that I'm from academia. So design and art for me, it's mainly a research tool for generating knowledge. So whatever I create, it's more for pondering a question or provoking a possibility. Obviously, I can think about life cycle analysis for designing product, but I really don't know the mere scale of the factors that need to be included to justify a product being produced and how sustainable it is and how much of human behavior it can change to justify its resource use. So yeah, I wouldn't have the expertise to talk about that. But I really use design as a way to think with the world and try to also avoid the production-driven mindset here, which is why I've been also thinking about more of what's the role of design and making in critical research that looks into science and technology and how to avoid those things.
It is sometimes about realizing where your limitations are and what your contribution is. And then if it were to be considered for further production, then a team or people with that expertise could come in and adapt it. But it is important, I guess, when we propose solutions that we consider what that solution does at a single point in time. And then if it were to continue, it might need to change or adapt. In a world where anthropocentric thinking is prevalent still, how do you think artists, designers, and of course, as you're talking to a jeweler, jewelers whose canvas is often the human body, could and should meaningfully engage with this theme?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think body is a very, very nice canvas, I must say. I'm pretty jealous of you guys. The reason why I think the body is really kind of fascinating because it's the mere physical presence that we have and the only portal we have to interact with the world and thus shape the way we understand and respond to it. It is a massive interface between human and nature. And just by altering perceptions or trying to, for example, what I've been trying to do, like adding sensations, modalities from different species and organisms, we could already think about what are the other ways that other organisms relate to the world and our body. It's so much shaping our identity. One of the fascinating projects that I've seen previously that it's about human body, but maybe not necessarily about jewelry, was I Want to Deliver a Shark. So this project by Aya Sagama considered alternative future where women could donate their womb to voluntarily give birth to endangered organisms. So just thinking about how our reproductive systems and our different parts of our bodies have like entrenched so deeply in our social and political systems are a very interesting way to think about how different jewelries could potentially challenge that. And in relation to the modern human, a thing that I'm recently thinking about is the moral status defined by our body politics. For example, the ability to feel pain being one of the main scales to define animal moral relevance. So the more that you're able to feel pain, and the more you are somewhat protected by animal welfare. And the ability to feel pain is like one of our bodily function, our perception, and then different perception has its political and moral weighting and social values. And if we think about it as an appendage that could be potentially altered by jury and use it to kind of challenge our current norms on how we load different values and different perceptions and different body plans, I think that is a very interesting way that I connect jury and body politics.
Your work is located really on the edge, science, design, art. Do you feel these labels are a little bit old-fashioned now? Or what do you think are sort of the benefits and disadvantages of this sort of disciplinary thinking?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's quite old-fashioned. The act of classification for fields is really to construct expertise and exclude people from other disciplines, I think. So mainly for me, what I'm doing is what I'm doing, and then it could land in a spectrum of different creative methods. For example, in design, I can think of a more kind of intervention-based, more structural kinds of creativity and looking into the artifact and materials with a specific focus. And from critical design, that is another field where you're trying to introduce a sense of reflexivity in design and trying to critique certain norms that are brought in by nature of design, which, for example, like production-driven agendas and dominant kind of social technological expectations of what design could produce. But sometimes you could also use art, which primarily maybe can pose open-ended questions. It can also lead to lots of the previous things that I mentioned, critical discussions and discourse, but not necessarily bound by the methods or agenda of design or critical design. But overall, they're all kind of overlapped. I think the benefit of talking about the different approaches is that you could shape your practice. You could appeal to different audience depending on who you're talking to.
For anyone who's interested in materials and exploring the boundaries between disciplines, what do you think are the real barriers? Do you have any advice for anyone who wants to go in this direction?
I can only say for more biology related field, I think you can start small because lots of biomaterial artists and designers really just work from their kitchens and work with kombucha or algae. There are lots of libraries on the internet that you could find and recipes that you could experiment with. And there are lots of community labs that are potentially available, like Open Cells in London and many other ones I don't remember the names of. And you need to be able to establish your first creative freedom and being able to make sure that you're not backing off when you're in a conflict with a scientific or technological agenda. I think that is one of the main tension that I came across in working with technologies or science that I don't necessarily understand. And then obviously there's another question in terms of accessibility. For me, I think coming from a environmental science background, there's a little bit of benefit there that I could understand both side of language, or I could get grasp of it quite quickly. But then there is an issue of if you don't have any background in STEM, there are difficulties. But I'm really glad that there are lots of cultural organizations and community labs that are growing and emerging. For example, like Back Society, Next Nature Network in the Netherlands, or Arts Laboratory Berlin, or there are lots of organizations that could that promote and mediate art science collaborations. Yeah, and then another challenge I think is the timeline, where artwork or design work often have a way shorter resource timeline than a technological development. For example, like biomaterial, when you want to work with organisms, it always takes a long time for them to grow, or if you require any genetic modification, it takes even longer time to do the experiment, let alone validate the material properties. So how to really align or grasp the sweet spot where the technology is ready there and available for you to explore different properties for artistic application. Or if the technology is still in its infancy, then maybe when you want to work with it, you can think about more of a speculative approach and thinking ahead and doing, for example, like design fictions to engage people to think about the future of this technology. So when we work with science technology, we need to first, well, there's no order, I guess. We want to understand where the technology is at this moment. What kind of role can we play as creative researchers that interface with technologists or scientists? and what are the kind of infrastructures are needed to actually carry out this collaboration. I think also one caveat is to kind of be mindful of the self-righteousness of exploring alternative materials, because I think currently the prospect is a little bit, well, as many other emerging technology, the prospect of it is always a bit too bigger than its actual functions, actual things that it could deliver. But other than like trying to, familiarize yourself or learning really in-depth technical understanding of the latest biotechnology, I think maybe to go back to what we have been always interacting with living organisms and living materials in a very, simple and rustic, like a more natural way, where it it is also important, but just because we take it for granted and they're not necessarily in trend or represented with the buzzword, doesn't mean that they don't embody the same essence of the way we try to interact. The goal of trying to redefine our relation with the living world.
What is in store for you in the near future? Is there anything you're working on that you're happy to share at this moment in time that we could be looking forward to seeing, hearing, reading from you in the near future?
So I just finished a quite intriguing, provocative slash scary project, which fused human and yeast cells together to create a kind of moral conundrum, thinking about how biotechnology has been like synthesizing different organisms' genomes, and what if I create one not for necessarily any functional purposes, but just to raise an ethical question that is representative of their way of treating life. So I created this human yeast hybrid and make bread with it. And I hosted a bunch of hypothetical, well, bread tasting events in Edinburgh during the science festival to invite people to think about if the act of adding human cells into a yeast could that share similar experience of exploitation, was narrated in the menu, could change people's perception of the moral status of yeast, or could it transfer empathy from the human side to the yeast? And how do people perceive synthetic organisms' moral status in the future, which would, when the organism's boundaries are increasingly broken down in synthetic biology, how do we think about the moral implication of it? And another project I'm working with is microbial revolt. So it's an artwork format of a previous study I had, thinking about how laboratory equipment could be redesigned to serve the purpose of organism revolt instead of being used as embedded oppressive tools to make organisms at work. So another spin-off from this idea is that I am working with antimicrobial resistance experts in Netherlands to think about what if we could create a sovereign state of microbes that lets them to challenge and revert the power dynamic between human and microbes in the different labor side of the microbes, for example, like gut or lab or in the soil, and to really make people think about to rethink antimicrobial resistance, not just as an epidemiological crisis, but also a rightful refusal to anthropocentric oppression to them. So these are my current thinking.
How has been the response towards the bread? How have people responded?
Most people find it outrageous, and they were very worried that if they ingested the bread with any human, remains, they might catch, unknown diseases. It's quite hard to really get people to think about the morality of microorganisms, and we have been really reliant on their service from millennia, from agriculture, and now more recently in the biolab, we're kind of really depending on their genomes to provide us tools. We're moving our manufacturing into the cells of microbes, and really it's quite a big thing to reckon with from a morality level and to account for their labor recognition. My website will try to keep updated to what I do.
When we think of jewelry, we often think of something that is chosen by someone to wear for an often rather human-centered reason. As jewelry makers, we therefore spend a lot of time understanding human sentiments and create art and designs for enriching the lives of others. But what if we could enrich the lives of non-human others too? What if we could make jewelry that would benefit birds, bees, or plants? What if we could make jewelry that would serve our environment, making us components in a system that enables an improvement in a non-human context? I'm not the first person to think this would be possible. So for investigating and sharing speculative design examples of how this could be done in the future, and for providing us with insights into your wider research, practice, and work, I would like to thank you a lot, Yuning. We are incredibly grateful for your time and very much look forward to seeing what you will be creating in the future.
Thank you for having me.
So next month, I'll be joined by another guest, so watch this space to find out who it is. But for now, this was Sophie Boons for the BAJ podcast episode titled Ecological Service Jewelry with Yuning Chen. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.